The world is in turmoil. The way the world works has been turned on its head. Billions are being spent to keep the world economy afloat, and around the globe, millions of people are facing an uncertain future. But out of crisis comes perhaps an opportunity to rebuild something better. Well, tonight on Sky News, our working life after the pandemic and our new world. A very good evening, I'm Dermot Murnaghan. Now, over the course of this week, I'm speaking to some of the leading lights in the worlds of culture, politics, science, and tonight, economics. Joining us a live virtual studio audience from all around the world who will be asking questions about how we can build a new future. And I say from around the world, they're from Mexico, Ghana, Italy, Spain, Greece, Argentina, and of course, the United Kingdom. Now, facing them, we have a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the former chief executive of BP Lord Browne. We also have the economist Stephanie Kelton, former advisor to the US Democratic Party. And joining them, Stephen Moore, a member of President Trump's coronavirus task force for the economy. Welcome to you all. So with jobs, finance and economics now under a strain not felt for many generations, tonight we look at the future for the economy and the world of work.
There's nothing anywhere.
Aisles are empty and there's just people as far as the eye can see.
I'm a critical care nurse. I've just finished 48 hours of work. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables. Just stop it.
Consider the impact their stocking up might have on others.
This is Regent Street, home to some of the biggest names in retail, and it's almost deserted.
They're talking about the economy contracting by 35%.
That would be the biggest quarterly fall we've ever seen.
The UK is facing a significant recession.
British Airways are set to make up to 12,000 workers redundant.
Virgin Atlantic Airways is to cut more than 3,000 jobs today.
Flybe is shortly being put into administration. It's all over, it's all gone. It's really sad.
It's unique in modern times. We've never seen anything like this.
For the first time in our history, the government is going to step in and help to pay people's wages.
F1 cars are out. Ventilator trolleys are in. The sheer scale and speed of what's happening here is clearly a triumph.
You feel so much more protected.
We are seeing the indomitable spirit of Britain.
Cheers.
The estate's online sales are up nearly 2,000%.
There are some fantastic ideas out there where, if we ever get over this, the world has to change.
Well, we're getting families ordering direct to the house. People have started cooking again.
I do think that the British tourism industry is going to hit the roof now.
Won't be just going back, it will be a new normal.
Well, there we have the changing way that our world is working. So let's dive in, go straight to our virtual audience gathered from all corners of the globe. And our first question tonight, that comes from Alex Liberto, who's in Rome. A very good evening to you, Alex. What would you like to ask our panel to kick us off?
Good evening. Yes, a friend of mine who was a successful businessman told me that in hindsight, he would have preferred to risk dying from the virus rather than to suffer the trauma, trepidation and degradation of certain poverty he now faces. So my question is, how can politicians and scientists come together to balance this rock and a hard place situation, considering that the efforts so far have only caused personal and social economic devastation?
Well, that really is quite a first question. Thank you very much indeed for that, Alex. Well, let's put it straight away to our panel. Very good evening to you all once again. And if I can start with you then, Professor Stiglitz, the issue, I suppose, is lockdown and all its consequences an economic price worth paying?
Oh, I think it's inevitable. Even if we didn't have the lockdown,
people would be so scared of the pandemic that they're not going to be going to the theater, they're not going to be buying lots of goods. So we would have, even without the lockdown, have had a serious economic downturn. And without the lockdown, the contagion of the disease would be much worse. And the perpetuation of the disease would be much worse. And so over the long run, I think we would suffer more. The countries like New Zealand that put in place good economic policies and good health policies have been able to mitigate the adverse economic effects and have put the pandemic under control.
Stephen Moore, can I bring you in here and ask you your view on that? Did this have to be done? Did there have to be almost global lockdowns, with a few exceptions?
Well, I can really only talk about the United States, but I think that what has happened over the last 2 or 3 months in the United States will go down in history as one of the greatest economic tragedies and one of the biggest political blunders of our time. We knew at the time that there were about 13 or to 15 major cities that had been impacted by coronavirus. We also knew from what was happening in China and Korea that what we all know now to be absolutely true, that this is an old person's disease, that people who had pre-existing conditions and people who were over the age of 65 were quite vulnerable. But we now know that young people are not vulnerable to this disease. So we made huge multi-trillion-dollar mistakes here. I agree with George Stigler that there would have been a huge impact on the economy, no question about it, if we had acted differently. But the idea of shutting down our economy was a catastrophic decision, not just for our economy, but the health effects of the coronavirus shutdown and lockdown have been arguably worse than what would have happened if we'd simply let people make their own decisions about whether to go out. And I'll make one other point. You all know that we are seeing these horrendous riots around the United States in major cities. These riots are a direct result of the lockdown. You can't keep the American people, especially young people, locked in their homes for 2 or 3 months and expect anything but this. And so I think that the kind of chaos we're seeing in American cities is a direct result of a very faulty policy of locking people in their homes.
Professor Stiglitz, just a quick rejoinder to that before I bring in our other two panelists.
I just have to respond very strongly. The protests in the United States are a result of police brutality. 50 years of police brutality, in fact, 150 years of police brutality. It is a result of a kind of brutality that has been inflamed by President Trump's vicious rhetoric. And that is the reason that our country is burning today.
OK, well, I'm going to bring, as I say, our other two panelists in a moment or two on that already, very polarised views. But I want to ask our audience, I want to put a straw poll to our audience by a show of hands, if you would. We're hearing there, one of our panellists thinks it's lockdown is a blunder. Another think, of course, it had to be done. So here's my question to you. Do you think the cure in the shape of the economic lockdown could prove worse than the disease itself? Hands up if you think the lockdown is worse than the virus. Well, that is just a handful, I'd say, 3 or 4. Another question for you then, audience, I'm just jotting that down. Hands up if you think that governments have generally, that have done it, if you think that governments have generally lifted lockdown too soon. Hands up if you think governments have generally lifted or started lifting their lockdowns too soon. What do you think about that? I'm saying 2/3 to 3/4 of our straw poll there. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. So let's get straight back to our panellists there. And Lord Browne, so we have people laying down their livelihoods and their jobs so that others can live. But according to our panellists, that is a price worth paying.
And I agree, it is a price worth paying to maintain the health of the vast majority of people through this lockdown. But rather than look at what could have been, I think we are where we are. And actually, we're learning a lot and we're changing a lot for the future, probably for the better. I can only speak from the point of view of business, but business is learning about different ways of doing business, more efficient, more localized, more national. There's more accelerated activity to make business more intelligent. There's a real understanding, perhaps, that nature has been a very big force here, a very big force. We don't want that to happen again. And so climate change is on the agenda still, probably reinforced. Something must be done to keep the environment, to keep us healthy. So there's many things that I think are happening here that will change the way we think about the future. And that is very important, because I think we probably couldn't have gone on the way we were going before the virus.
And to be explored a lot more deeply during the course of this next hour. But Stephanie Kelton, on that straw poll from our audience there, about 3 or 4 of them thinking that the lockdown was not a price worth paying, but 3/4 of them thinking that lockdown has been lifted too soon. Your thoughts on that, and more broadly?
Well, my first thought is that I agree completely with Professor Stiglitz that the lockdown itself is not what ultimately led consumers to withdraw from economic activity in a huge way. It was fear of the virus itself. It was fear of contracting a very contagious and lethal virus. And people would have withdrawn independent of governors or other public officials asking them to shelter in place and socially distance and so forth. So, look, I think that what we have now is a situation where we're starting to open things up, and there is a safe way to do that. And the scientists are telling us how to safely reopen this economy. And what it really requires is a great deal of testing, contact tracing, isolating people when they become infected. We know what needs to be done. We're just not executing well. And we're not anywhere near the level of testing that we need to safely begin to reopen the economy. And so once again, it is us versus the virus, and consumer psychology plays the overwhelming kind of driving force in all of this. If people don't feel safe, they're not going to re-engage fully with the economy. They're not going to go back into restaurants and bars and theaters. And so we are at a stage now where, in a very real sense, it's in our hands to determine the pace of this recovery, how quickly we can get back to, engaging with the economy in a way that's familiar to us. But until enough people feel safe going back and re-engaging, I think you're going to continue to see an economy that struggles to recover.
OK, well, let's broaden this out a bit, because we've been conducting a wide-ranging opinion poll for these programmes about the future facing the world, and it revealed some really striking insights into what the British public wants to change. Now, this is what we asked people. We asked them to consider the types of jobs people do and the different things that British companies sell and invest in. Let me take you through some of these significant results then. We asked, once the outbreak is over, how should the British economy be structured? Now, a quarter of people, precisely that, 25%, said they believe the economy should go back to being much the same as it was before. As I say, a quarter, but more than double that, 57%, said they thought the economy should be significantly different to before. And you know what? One of our studio audience has a question that relates directly to that. He's Jeremy Baker from London. Jeremy, can you put your question to the panel for us, please? And a very good evening to you.
Hi. Isn't this a perfect opportunity for us to jump straight into the new modern Britain, say goodbye to the past? I'm very worried that Rishi Sunak is spending our money on old companies and old jobs.
Well, there we are. A lot to take in there in a fairly short question from Jeremy Baker, and taking on board our poll as well. And Lord Browne, then, you were touching on it already. 57% of those polls said they thought the economy should be and would be significantly different to before. How can it be?
Well, changing economies takes a lot of time and effort. But I think, again, before the pandemic struck, there were some things going on which I think now will be accelerated. The first was to heavily invest in innovation, in smaller companies doing a lot of R&D, the government was going to, and I still think will, increase the amount of state spending on R&D by 50%, and that would mean business will follow that at least at that level, if not double that. And so there's a lot of things going on which write the future. We can't go on just investing in old companies. We have in this economy far too much concentration. For example, in aerospace and automotive, a lot of the developments for the future were taking place. They've now been cruelly shut down. So we need to diversify, we need to change the way in which we apply things. If I may say so, I think in this economy, we're great at innovating and discovering things, the science and engineering. We're not very good at retaining the companies here. We have a wonderful track record in artificial intelligence, for example. But of the 4 great companies that we invented here, they all went to American investors and to America.
But of course,
so we need to change.
Yeah, I mean, but the change all takes time. And addressing Jeremy's question directly, Stephanie Kelton, in effect, he's saying all these furlough schemes, these job retention schemes, some of them, we don't know how many yet, some of them are zombie jobs. There will be no real work to go back to.
Well, I think he's right. I mean, you know, the reality of the situation is that a large number of industries may permanently shrink. A lot of the small businesses that we are helping today may not make it on the other side. In fact, we know that they won't. Maybe as many as half of them won't be viable on the other side of this. But what do you do in the immediate term when you've got tens of millions of people whose livelihoods are tied to their jobs, and there is a way to get immediate aid to those individuals? You can't know in advance which companies are going to be successful and which won't make it on the other side. And in a crisis, speed is everything. So what the government did, I think, was the right thing, to try to help companies hold things together, to keep employees on payroll, to help these small businesses meet their recurring expenses, try to help them remain viable, so that if we get through this, then we maybe end up with fewer failed companies. But the reality is that some of the bigger industries are going to permanently change. And, the benefit is that we will have time in the months and years ahead to begin to think about how to make strategic investments and in which industries to support. But in the short term, time is everything. And getting the money out really was critically important to try to containing the collateral damage.
Well, Stephen Moore, what do you think about that? The government's role that Stephanie Kelton touched on there in choosing the jobs of the future. And what do you think they're going to be?
Well, that's the whole point, is none of us know what those industries of the future will be. A good example is, for the last 10 years, the United States of America went through the greatest oil and gas boom in the history of this country, and we became the energy powerhouse nation. Nobody in government predicted that would happen. In fact, in the midst of it, Barack Obama said we were going to, dig for the last barrel of oil in the United States in the midst of this boom. So my point is, politicians don't know what the next industry is. The people who know that and who are going to make the right decisions are private investors. We've made a lot of really, really bad decisions over the last couple of months. For example, in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, we started paying people as much or more. In fact, in 31 states now out of the 50 in the United States, people are paid more money to stay unemployed than to go on a job. Now, you don't have to be an economist to understand that's a really stupid thing to do. And now we have a big, big problem in terms of we do have our businesses back starting to revive themselves, especially in the red states of America with Republican governors that are up and running. And that's good news. And by the way, they're doing it in a way that's actually keeping people safe and healthy. But what's so interesting about this is that you've got these states now that are up and running, and the businesses are starting to hire again. And we have this strange situation where we have about 35 million people unemployed in the United States, but businesses can't get people back on the job because of stupid government policies that are paying them to stay unemployed.
So, Joseph Stiglitz, do we have to pull the rug then on these job support schemes, or indeed keep them going? I mean, let the market decide.
Oh, let's be clear. The reason people don't want to go back to work is they don't want to get the disease. And the government agency that's supposed to protect people, which in the United States is called OSHA, Health and Safety of the Workers, has, under the Trump administration, been asleep. It didn't require people to have protective gear, didn't provide masks, didn't provide tests. And that's why people are afraid to go to work. It's just very simple. If your choice is work or dying, people would rather not die. It was absolutely essential that we provide assistance. Now, the way that money has been administered by the Trump administration and the legislation that was adopted was not the best designed. You contrast the programs that were enacted in several of the European countries, in New Zealand, where they said, let's keep the connection between employees and their firms. Let's keep that going so that when we do recover, that connection will be there and we can start up the economy. That was the idea, and most of these other countries succeeded. UK had something like that and succeeded. The United States is #1 in unemployment, #1 in disease, #1 in deaths. And that's all because of failed policies. And the policy we're talking about here is the failure to design a program that would provide income to ordinary individuals and keep them at the same time connected with their employer, particularly important in this pandemic, because most Americans rely on health insurance provided by the employer, not like other civilized countries. We don't recognize in the United States the right of access to health care. And in the last 3 years, life expectancy is already down. And without health insurance, it's going to get even worse.
OK, well, plenty more to continue with. I want to go back to our exclusive After the Pandemic poll, something it tells us about the economic priorities of the public. We asked people to spend a moment thinking about the money the government has borrowed during the course of the outbreak. Now, here's what we found. 49% said they thought ministers should maintain spending, even if that meant the amount of borrowing and the national debt grew larger. That's against 20% who said they believed the government should reduce borrowing and attempt to balance the budget. So 49%, nearly half, saying maintain this spending, 20% saying reduce the borrowing. So more than 2 to 1 in favour of continuing the spending. Stephen Moore.
Well, I just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday showing that if we continue to spend it the way we're doing in the United States for the first time in American history, government spending at all levels will be higher than our private sector. That is a very scary thing for the land of the free, a country that is supposed to believe in free markets. And you know, if you have the government now larger than the entire production of private enterprise and private worker output, that means that this is more than Bernie Sanders could have ever imagined. So we have to stop the spending. What I have proposed, and Art Laffer and other economists, is to suspend the payroll tax that's imposed on every worker in America and every small business in America as a way to get people back to work. And by the way, the professor's just wrong on this. Professor, people under the age of 35 are not vulnerable to the coronavirus. That's the one lesson we've learned, that 2/3 of the deaths have been people in nursing homes in the last year of their life. So there's been a scare campaign by the media that has not informed people what's really happening. We didn't know that 8 weeks ago. We do know that now, that we have to keep our seniors safe. The governors like Andrew Cuomo did not keep their nursing homes safe, and they're responsible for thousands of lives. But young people can return to the job. They do want to return the job, and that should be their choice. They should make if they don't feel safe to go back to the job, they shouldn't have to. But I guarantee you, there are tens of millions of Americans who want to get back on the job, and they can do so safely.
Well, Stephanie Kelton, take that on board as well, along with the continue the spending. There's a lot of science coming up from that position as well, a lot of medicine as well. Let the young people out and they can kickstart the economy.
All right. So we continue to say that until people feel safe, they are not going to re-engage with the economy. I think that is the correct thing to say. This virus does not discriminate. Yes, some age demographics get more heavily hit, but frontline workers, overwhelmingly younger people, also contracted this virus. And we're still learning a lot about this virus. We're learning that it infects the blood system, the blood vessels. And so we don't yet know exactly who the vulnerable population is, but one life is too many to take risks and chances and say, oh, well, these people were almost at the on death's door anyway, so what difference does it make? Let's carry on with the economic activity and let the old folks just fall away. That's awful. Okay, look, on this point about the payroll tax and this idea that the way that we're going to restart the economy is by cutting payroll taxes, it is almost as if the Republican Party and Stephen, who helps to advise this party, manages in every possible situation to find a way to get money to the people who least need the help. You're talking about a payroll tax holiday, which means that you want to cut taxes for people who are on payroll, who are employed. What we're worried about are the 40 million people who have already lost their jobs. They've lost their income. And to the extent that they go back into the workplace, it's because we've allowed their unemployment insurance to expire. We didn't extend it. They don't have alternatives. They've got to meet rent. They've got to buy food. They have to pay bills. And they're going to be forced back into an economy that is a dangerous environment with a pandemic that is still raging. Why? Because we are not anywhere close to doing the testing we ought to be doing at this stage. We need to be testing about 23 million people a day. We are nowhere near that. So we're telling people to go back out where it's dangerous and work and produce, and they will have no alternative.
OK, we've got a question on that topic, on taxes, coming up. We have a question from Nadeem Ahmed from West London about the impact the government's actions and the furlough scheme in particular might have. Nadeem, please share your question with us.
Hi, good evening, Dermot. Good evening, panel. Good afternoon, panel. Basically, given that we will be in a recession after the pandemic's finished, what taxes might the government consider to cover for the costs of the furlough schemes?
OK, taxes, will they have to go up? Can I just ask you while you're with us, Nadeem, have you been furloughed or have you lost your job or anything like that?
Yeah, I've lost my job due to the pandemic. It did impact the business. So I'm one of those unfortunate ones. And yes, so hence the reason why my question, I didn't get furloughed. That is a question that's been addressed elsewhere. But that was my main concern, to see what we do with that. OK,
the costs involved in all this, will taxes have to rise? Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Nadeem. I should say one of our panellists, Stephen Moore, has had to go in his advisory role. We are told he has to take a call from the White House. He will be back to rejoin us, and perhaps he might share with us what discussions he has had, given what's going on in the United States at the moment. But let's ask about taxes and costs, and we've been talking about tax cuts to stimulate the economy. Lord Browne, which way do you think it should go in the UK as it tries to recover with this huge amount of spending, huge amount of debt being accrued, a huge deficit building, 300 billion plus perhaps in this year? Should taxes rise as a result?
I expect taxes will rise as a result. It's a practical matter. I do think several other things will happen. First is it's very clear that the government will end up owning pieces of companies. And they have to decide what to do, not to drive them as bureaucracies, but to drive them in an enlightened way so that they can expand and flourish when they come out of care as they are at the moment. Secondly, I do think taxes will rise, and that would be expected. And thirdly, debt levels, I think, will stay high for some time until we can get back on a growth track. So we have to be very careful. I think we will probably have an attitude of make do in many areas. We will probably expand investment in other areas which will increase jobs, which at the cost of investment as opposed to revenue expenditure from the government as well as business. But
Nadeem, I see you nodding along to that. Do you think taxes should rise or just will have to rise?
Well, I think from a business perspective, it would make sense. But I think looking at all those people who've been furloughed, they probably should have to shoulder some of those. I mean, you've got to remember, not everybody's been furloughed, so it'd be very unfair for those to have to pay taxes to an extent to cover the costs, especially if they have never taken anything from the government. I mean, I think maybe it needs to be looked at in a fair way, perhaps.
Joseph Stiglitz, on the overall borrowing and spending and the tax approach, 8 trillion I saw today is the congressional estimate on what the United States is going to have to borrow, print or find over the next 10 years to pay for all this. $8 trillion.
Well, first, let me say that the debt itself is not going to be much of a problem because we're likely to see a very weak economy. Interest rates are going to be very low. All the forecasts are for very low interest rates as far as the eye can see. The market says this. So if interest rates are close to zero, the cost of the debt, servicing the debt, is close to zero. So I'm not worried about the debt for the immediate future. And to echo what was said before, the worries about the debt should not inhibit us from doing what we need to do to protect the vulnerable and to resuscitate the economy. Now, at the same time, there is room for increased taxation, more room in the United States than in the UK. But for instance, I'm sure Lord Browne will agree on this, we have to redirect our economy to the economy of the future. And one area of that economy of the future is a greener economy. So environmental taxes would have a double benefit. They would raise revenue and they would steer the economy towards a better economy, to a greener economy. And you can do this in ways that are distributionally beneficial. A second example, in the United States, the corporations are not paying their fair share of taxes. So they were, and we know that we have many corporations with a lot of monopoly power, and they're making their returns not from innovation, but it's from the exploitation of monopoly power. And if we could tax some of that monopoly power, huge sources of revenues that we could use. And in the United States, the people at the top, the very richest, are actually paying a lower tax than people down below. So we have a regressive tax system. If we just had a fair tax system, we would have a lot more tax revenue. The same thing is true to a lesser extent in the UK.
Stephanie Kelton, I'm sure you agree with an awful lot of that. But as I say, $8 trillion or more just for the United States. Sure, the United States can either borrow or print it, but ultimately, won't that be inflationary?
You just hit on the critical point. I mean, that is the relevant limit. So if we are looking at an economy that is depressed and that is likely to remain depressed for years to come. In fact, just yesterday here in the United States, the Congressional Budget Office released a report saying that they anticipate now that the United States economy is going to sacrifice the equivalent of about $16 trillion in lost output over the course of the next 10 years. Why? Because they expect that the economic recovery is going to be very sluggish, that we're not going to operate our economy at full employment. In other words, we're going to have depressed conditions for a very long period of time. What that means is that there is room in the economy for the federal government to provide continued support in the form of fiscal policy. That fiscal support can eat up some of that slack in the economy and help move us to a more robust recovery and a quicker return to full employment. So I'm not preoccupied with the size of the deficit or the impacts on the debt. What I care about is what you just mentioned, the inflation risk. If we try to drive things too fast, too far, are, the punishment is not going to be insolvency for the federal government. It's not going to be that we wreck our finances. It's going to be that we cause inflation to accelerate. I don't think we're anywhere near facing that kind of a risk. I think the much greater risk is that we do too little, not too much, and we end up with double-digit unemployment for a prolonged period of time and an economy that continues to fall well short of full employment.
OK, so inflation not a risk in your estimation at the moment. Listen, time for another question from our virtual audience, and I know it's a specific one. Phil Docking, who joins us from Crete. Very good evening to you, Phil. And what would you like to ask?
Good evening. Well, given the predictions that the job market will contract drastically after the pandemic, isn't it time to ditch the capitalism-light model of full employment and start working on more progressive economic policies such as universal basic income?
Aha, universal basic income. I wondered when that might come up. From Phil there, Joseph Stiglitz nodding along there. Well, for the uninitiated, like most of us, what is it? How does it work? I know it's been tried out in some countries, in some areas. Just explain the bones of this policy.
Well, universal basic income says you'll give money to everybody, universal, a basic level that allows them to survive. And it says, not means testa, you don't have application forms, you don't have to go through a bureaucracy. Everybody gets it. Well, I'm not a big fan of universal basic income. And the reason for that is very simple. Right now, and for the next 15, 20, 25 years, we have an enormous amount of things that need to be done. We have to finance the green transition. We have huge deficiencies in our infrastructure. There are people who need health care. We have a large number of jobs that need to be done. And we have people who want to work. That mismatch is the failing of our market economy today. And what we need to do is to say everybody who wants a job and is able to get to work ought to have a job. That was the commitment in the United States what we made in the Full Employment Act of 1948. And that should be our primary commitment today. And it's exactly what Stephanie is saying. There are lots of people who want to work. There's dignity associated with work. And our failure is not to have our economic system provide that work, given all the things that need to be done today.
OK, so jobs, not free money, not a universal basic income. In your estimation there, Professor, let's see if our audience agree with you. Another straw poll, if you would very much appreciate this. Let me ask you about the universal basic income. How many of you would like to see a change in the way the economy works? Put your hands up if you would support a universal basic income. Now you know how it works after listening to Professor Stiglitz. And let me add the rider in there, even if it meant a significant increase in taxes. So here's the question. Hands up if you would support a universal basic income, even if it meant a significant increase in taxes. Well, 80%. Disagreeing, perhaps, with Joseph Stiglitz. And Lord Browne, let me ask you, isn't it then a disincentive to work? If you've got just enough to live on being given to you by the state, why would you work?
Well, part of it is, I think, explained in dignity. I think people do actually want to work in the large bulk. But it's right that there should be not disincentives. It's crazy if people earn more money by not working rather than actually working. So we need to think very carefully. And we've been, I think the nations have moved from, basic minimum wage to living wage. And there are progressive changes here, which I think we shouldn't stand in the way of. I mean, there'll be more changes. You're absolutely right. We've got tons of things to do. We need people in work. We need them trained in the right way. But to get the economy to be really green, to get net zero emissions, we need brand new jobs. I think in healthcare, we've seen probably a lack of people who do one thing that only humans can do, which is to give people empathy. Probably we need more workers in this particular area. And then as to infrastructure, there's so much of it that needs replacing for a modern economy that there's a huge amount to do there. So I think that there's a lot which has to be done. We need to encourage and inspire people to want to have these jobs.
And Stephanie Kelton, just your view on the universal basic income. Well, you said before, Professor Stiglitz, that it should be about jobs. But don't we then end up with work creation schemes, governments paying people to dig holes and fill them in again?
No, what you end up with, I think, in a properly run public service employment or job guarantee program are the local communities themselves engaging in the process and deciding what they value and the kind of work that would be the most meaningful, add the most value to their lives and their community. So what you might imagine is a program that is federally funded, but highly decentralized, locally administered, so that people in, I'll use the US case, in northeastern Oklahoma know best what the needs of that community are. The federal government does not, but the federal government can provide the funding so that people can be hired and employed. We did this in the New Deal era. We had the Works Progress Administration. We had the Civilian Conservation Corps. We had a jobs program for young people called the National Youth Administration. So FDR rolled out a whole alphabet soup of public job programs, and we could seriously consider modeling job programs today on something like that. It wouldn't preclude a basic income. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, and other civil rights leaders, they said there should be a basic income for those who cannot or should not work. And so we can decide as a society who falls into those categories of, people that should not be in the workforce, but there ought to be a way for those who want to work to have employment if they choose it and can't find it anywhere else in the economy. As Joe said, there is a great deal of work, as both of them said. There is plenty of work that needs to be done.
OK, well, I'm glad to say that Stephen Moore is back with us after doing a bit of work with the White House. I want your views on a universal basic income and, of course, what you were hearing there about an FDR-type New Deal for the 21st century. But can you share with us, feedback to us, any of your discussions with your White House colleagues?
Well, I would, but I'd have to kill you. I'm just teasing.
I don't think you'd be able to get over here.
I was very proud to work with the president on his campaign as an economic advisor. We put together a plan that cut taxes on our businesses to make America more competitive. We slashed regulations. We put in place new trade deals that made America more competitive and that worked more to America's advantage. We created the best economy in 30 or 40 years. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate until the coronavirus hit. We had 6 million surplus jobs. I hear you all talking about, gee, how do we create jobs? Donald Trump did it. We had the best, we had rising wages for every income group. Minorities saw the biggest increases in wages. It was a beautiful thing, the best economy. So how do we rebuild the economy? We do exactly what we were doing before. We reduce taxes. We reduce regulations and red tape that are onerous on businesses. And we have good trade deals. And by the way, a big part of that is our energy policy. The idea that we're going to give up our oil and gas and coal is ridiculous. Those are major sectors of our economy. But we do know how to create jobs. We did a great job of it. And that's going to be really what this election coming up in November is going to be about. Do you want to create the kind of economy that we had under Donald Trump before the coronavirus hit, where 68% of Americans felt like the economy was going in the right direction? And I would just say one other thing. This is an international audience. Folks, it is not complicated. Reduce your taxes on your businesses. Reward them by reducing regulations that don't make sense. Do things that are making your own economies and businesses more competitive, and get the government the hell out of the way. That's what Donald Trump did, and boy, did it work.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the other panelists are taking a radically different view on that than you. Now, we've got a very important question coming up, I know, but I just want to very briefly, if you would, to the other three of you, address that issue. Tax cuts and allow the market and entrepreneurs to shape the future economy. Stephanie Kelton.
Look, we know what happened with these tax cuts. The way the personal income tax cuts were structured in the tax cuts that were passed at the end of 2017, 83% of the benefits went to people in the top 1% of the income distribution. This is simply funneling a windfall to the people who least need the help. On the corporate side, you say cut taxes for your business, and this is how to rain jobs down on the rest of the economy. But we know that businesses overwhelmingly took those windfalls and did what? Mergers and acquisitions and stock buybacks. They did not raise wages. They did not increase hiring. So especially in an environment like this, the way to incentivize businesses to hire people back is to swamp them with customers. And the way to swamp them with customers is to build robust increases in people's incomes. Jobs, incomes create consumers who create demand, who create jobs.
But Lord Browne, don't tax cuts put money in people's pockets and create demand?
It depends how they're done. And I think I'm all in favor of incentives for business that create opportunities and actually create investment. I think that is really very important because that's about the future. So I think that's essential. I also think that while regulations can be misplaced, equally, I think a totally free corporate sector would not be a sector I'd want. It is something that has to be contained by the interest of all stakeholders, not just investors, but also employees and the communities and the people who don't have a voice, the environment and so forth. So I think that I don't buy a package of total liberalization. I buy a package of balanced activity. If tax cuts lead to really better investment, and so far they've not done that in the United States, then I think it would be a great thing to have.
OK, listen, we've got some, we are indeed beginning to run out of time. So we've got a very important question, as I say, coming up from one of our virtual audience. This is from Amber Curry in Oxfordshire. Please fire away, Amber.
Hello, thanks for having me. As a recent graduate, I'm worried about how I can enter an industry that is so reliant on face-to-face contact. I've deferred my master's as a result of COVID-19, but will I be able to gain industry experience in the meantime? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Amber. Very important. And Joseph Stiglitz, we've touched on this already, but let's address it directly. This crisis is generational. It's young people who are not getting training, not going to get jobs to save older people. That's what the statistics tell us about coronavirus. Sorry, Professor Stiglitz, I wondered if you could still hear me. The question about the generational divide.
Yes, we've had a generational divide. It's actually been going on for a long time. One of the problems is that wages have been stagnant, and this has been particularly true in recent years. And part of the reason is unfettered capitalism hasn't been working for ordinary individuals. At the bottom, the wages in the United States, for instance, are the same as they were 60 years ago. Median income, income in the middle, has been stagnating. So, in fact, the market has created this divide between the young people and the old. They can't buy houses. They're left with huge amounts of student debt to go to school. In the United States, over $1.5 trillion. Now, the question that you asked is, what about the jobs? And it seems to me that what we need to do in the face of the pandemic is to say every young person should either be in a job, in school, or in some kind of a training program. And the pandemic will be over eventually. I feel confident of that. And the question is, what is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years? Are the years going to be wasted, or can you get some skills that will provide you with better opportunities in the post-pandemic world? And that's what we need to be focusing on right now.
Stephanie Kelton, we've touched on this a little bit earlier as well. And can I ask you what we're seeing on the streets of so many American cities at the moment? Yes, of course, sparked by a racist killing, but we're seeing many, many young people in particular. There's unemployment, there's inequality rife in the United States and indeed countries like the one I'm in at the moment. Is this perhaps one of the outcomes that we could continue to see from this crisis?
I mean, people in distress will take to the streets and let you know that they are in distress. So at the moment, you're right. What we're seeing are a lot of protests that are being driven by the fact that, you know, we continue to see again and again and again in this country, police officers taking the lives of African Americans, murdering them on the streets. We see these images all the time. It's festering. It's coming with the backdrop of COVID-19, where we're all uniquely, keenly aware of the fact that the frontline workers who bore disproportionately the pain associated with job losses, income losses, and so forth were people of color. So we see the inequities. We see how unfair this is. What you have are Blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians, Americans and Native people are coming together to say this is unjust, all of it, not just the killings, but the whole of the system is rotten. And people are saying we are not going to stand for an economic and social system that operates this way in the future.
And Stephen Moore, well, clearly, obviously not to be condoned, but is it understandable then what is happening on the streets of these American cities?
Is it understandable? Well, I think the better question is it justifiable? And I think almost everyone agrees that this criminal behavior has to stop. And I think President Trump is right that we have to stop the rioting and looting. It is outrageous. It is hurting the very people in these communities that have been afflicted by, with low incomes and so on. So it's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing we're seeing in these cities. And frankly, I think Americans are sick and tired of people apologizing for really radical behavior that, as I said, is hurting these very people who are supposed to be benefiting from this. Now, look, we have two Americas right now. We have an America of red states. That's what's kind of unique about the United States, that the states really do run the show. And we have red states like Georgia and Florida and Texas and Tennessee that are booming, absolutely booming, have had twice the rate of growth and twice the rate of job creation over the last 20 years. And then you have these states like New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and my home state of Illinois and other states that are run by Democrats that have been run into the ground. And those are the places where the riots have been worse. So why don't we use the policies that work? Lower taxes, lower regulations. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulations. I'm saying we should reward our businesses for hiring people and doing a great job and expanding. And look, we had a great economy 2.5 months ago. There was no unemployment. There were 6 million surplus jobs in this country. It was the best labor market we ever had. We've got to get back to those policies. But no, we can never justify violence, and we can never justify people burning down buildings and spray painting obscenities on churches. We can't tolerate that.
Because no one's justifying it. The question was if we can understand the forces that are driving it. I just want to bring Amber back in there because, Amber, I saw you reacting to that, and I don't know what your thoughts were. So share them with us, what you're hearing there.
I just think that the issue really, and I can't speak as I'm not an American, but it to me really seems like it's not about looting and violence. And I think the violence that needs to be stopped is coming more from the police rather than any protesters.
OK, well, thank you for that input, Amber. And I just want to hear from Lord Browne. And, let's broaden this out about young people like Amber. They're the seed capital of future society, of future economies. If we get this wrong, we could be in trouble.
Absolutely. We must not get it wrong. And the problem is judging it in the middle of the turmoil of today, where there's a lot of people without jobs because there's not a lot of activity. But again, I come back to, building a different world requires a lot of different skills, and that world will be different. Just simply the amount and changing of the way we live and work, what we're doing today on Skype, for example, will change the demands we have on infrastructure, the demands we have on the cloud, the demands we have on all sorts of things. This will require a lot more effort. And we need young people to do that, to aspire to do things to change society too in a low carbon world. So I think we need a bit of patience. We need to force, absolutely, the educational and training systems to be fit for purpose for the future, and to do this now while we have time. And I think that is beginning to happen. I'm very struck by the fact that many universities have said, we can't teach except face-to-face, and they've all said, we're teaching online. It's a very big change. And it says that a lot of things can change very quickly.
OK, well, that's, I'm afraid, believe it or not, almost it for tonight. But before we go, I want to take our final straw poll from our virtual audience. Hello again. Let's work your hands for one more time, and thank you for your great questions. By a show of hands, I want to ask you simply, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the economic future? So the optimists, please, put your hands up. Optimists. Oh, that's not bad. That's probably maybe over a third. Well, just very quickly, can I ask you then, how many of you have become optimists because of what you've heard tonight? Right. OK. Well, one of you, at least we've changed one mind. Thank you all very much indeed. So tonight we've heard arguments in favour of a universal basic income. The audience in favour, the experts not. Calls for more intervention to support young people survive any economic downturn. And the lockdown described as the greatest political and economic blunder of modern times. Well, my thanks, first of all, to our panellists tonight. You know them all by now. Joseph Stiglitz, Lord Browne, Stephanie Kelton and Stephen Moore. Not once, but twice. Thank you all very much indeed. And thanks too to everyone in our virtual studio audience, getting those hands up and down. Some brilliant questions. Thank you for taking part. Those questions really did expand our understanding, I hope. And thank you at home for watching. We've got much more to come this week, including an exclusive interview with the Prince of Wales on his experience of the lockdown and the changes facing the public, the country and the world. We'll bring you that on Thursday nights. More world-changing ideas tomorrow evening, when I'll be joined by, among others, one of the country's leading scientists, Sir Jeremy Farrar. That's at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. Do join us then if you can. For now, good night.